Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Building a Science of Reading Ecosystem, Demystifying the Science of Reading at MTSS. My name is Victoria, and I'm a marketing manager here at Amplify, and I'm so excited to have you all here today. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes for people to join, and then we'll get started and kick off our webinar with Susan. While you're waiting, feel free to put in the chat where you're coming from today. And what you love most about the science of reading. We'd love to hear from you in the chat. I see a lot of people saying they're from Columbus, Ohio. That's great. I actually used to live in Columbus, grew up in Columbus. It's a great city. I'm actually in Cleveland now, so love Ohio here. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Once again, my name is Victoria and I am a marketing manager at Amplify, and we're going to kick off our webinar series, The Science of Reading is for Everyone, today with our first webinar, Building a Science of Reading Ecosystem, Demystifying the Science of Reading in MTSS. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we'll email out the recording link for you to rewatch as you like tomorrow in an email. And everyone here will also receive a certificate of attendance, so please look out for that in your email as well. We have a live captioner with us, so if you want to access the captions, click on live transcript in the bottom tray. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them at the end. We welcome any comments in the chat, and to start, please let us know where you're coming from and what your role in education is, and also what you love about the science of reading. Just a quick note too, we do have more webinars in this series. So if you haven't signed up for more, you can do so at amplify.com, SOR-everyone-fall 2022, and we can talk more about that later. So thank you for joining us today. I do want to introduce our amazing presenter today. We're so excited to have Susan Lambert join us to kick off this webinar series. You probably know her as the host of our chart-topping Science of Reading, the podcast, which is celebrating 2.5 million downloads, but she's also our Chief Academic Officer of Elementary Humanities here at Amplify, and she's an expert of all things science of reading. Thank you so much for joining us, Susan. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Victoria. Thank you so much for the introduction, and go Ohio, huh?
OH.
All right. Well, like Victoria said, this is the first in a series of our webinars, and we'll talk more at the end about the next and upcoming webinars. But my goal for today is to really talk about this ecosystem. What does MTSS mean in this ecosystem, and set you up for the next series of webinars that we're really going to dive in the elements of it with some real experts. I know Victoria called me an expert. I like to say I'm a good translator and help set people up for those experts that can help you out. So here we go. We're going to try to demystify the science of reading in MTSS. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to talk about 4 things today. We're going to talk about some common myths and misconceptions, both in the science of reading and in multi-tiered systems of support. And we'll try to get through that quickly, but then we're going to understand how SOR and MTSS are complementary, because they really are. We're going to unpack and review a little bit of the science of reading before we outline then elements of MTS. So for those of you that have listened to the podcast, that have joined us on other webinars, some of this is going to be review, but I think it's always good to review and find out how things fit together. So hopefully that sounds good to you. Those are our goals for today. If you do have a question, if you wouldn't mind popping it in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box, that will help Victoria and help me if we have time at the end to take a few questions. All right, so let's start by correcting some misconceptions. First of all, let's start with some science of reading misconceptions, and you maybe have heard me talk about these before. So, some people are saying, oh, the science of reading thing, it is just another fad. It's going to come and it's going to go. It's like the pendulum swinging from one side to the other. And I've actually started using that pendulum swing as an example, because actually, if you're caught in the pendulum swing of going back and forth, you're actually caught in the fad. And science helps us actually step outside that back and forth momentum of a fad and move forward and take steps forward as we follow that science. So I encourage you to step out of that pendulum swing and start thinking about the science and following the science and what it tells us about effective reading instruction. People think that science of reading advocates think it's a one size fits all. You just want to do the same thing for all the kids. And that's not actually true. And so MTSS will actually help us to dispel this myth and figure out when do we know the things that we need to change based on our approach. We also hear a lot, oh, you science of reading people, all you care about is teaching phonics. And in the next slide, we're going to find out that's absolutely not true. Phonics, foundational skills, word recognition is an essential and important and critical element. You have to have it, but it's not the only thing that's involved in science of reading. Some people think science of reading implementation is just about a curriculum or a program, right? You might see curriculum providers now just stamping science of reading all over, and it's a pretty ubiquitous stamp. That's actually not true. So the science of reading is not about a curriculum or program. The science of reading is about an approach and what we know about how kids learn how to read. And then some people are like, well, this approach is just like kill and drill. It really disengages students. They don't have fun. It's boring. And that's not true either. So if that's the way your science of reading approach, implementation, curriculum looks in the classroom, you're not doing something right, because it can be very engaging to build students' confidence and competence as readers, and they get really excited about seeing their potential unlock as they're able to apply more and more of their skill. I love the Science of Reading Defining Guide from the Reading League. And if you have not yet accessed this or download it, I really encourage you to do it. You can Google the Reading League, go right on their site and find this defining guide. And it really outlines some important elements about the science of reading movement. And I've highlighted in orange some of the things that I think are most important to dispel some of these myths. First of all, it's a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and writing. So it's about developing literacy skills in our students, developing them to be both strong readers and proficient writers. And notice it's interdisciplinary. So it just doesn't come from one discipline. What people are doing is looking at what it takes to develop proficiency in both reading and writing and coming at it from multiple ways: linguistics, cognitive science, all different ways. And it's been conducted for 5 decades across the world, thousands and thousands of studies. There is a preponderance of evidence, and that evidence continues to move forward. There's some areas where we feel like, there's enough evidence that we know, right, what we should be doing in the classroom. There's other areas that we have indicators or evidences of avenues we should go down, and we start to do that. And there's some areas that still need more exploration. But frankly, there's enough evidence for us to be able to apply that to our reading instruction and how we structure things in the classroom. And really, the goal of all of this is so that we can prevent later reading difficulties. And I want you to pay attention to this prevention of and intervention for, because we're going to see that sort of overlapping as we talk about MTSS. All right, MTSS, some common misconceptions around MTSS. It's just a focus on individual students who need intervention support. And it's actually not focusing on individual students. And so we're going to see how, as its definition is, systems of support. We're talking about a system that takes a view of both whole schools, whole grade levels, whole classrooms, and sometimes the individual student, but it's not just to focus on those students. MTSS has sometimes, just like science of reading, been attributed to some specific assessment or curriculum or program, and it's not one of those, right? It's a system of support, and we can plug in different programs, assessments, curriculums into that, monitor and see how they're working, but it's just not a program that you plug and play. Some people think that MTSS is a process for identifying students for special education services. We can use that process to help with that, but that's not the ultimate goal of MTSS. It also shouldn't be separate from special education, because when we're thinking about serving the needs of all of our students, we want to look at that again in a systems approach, which will include all of the services that we provide within the school. And sometimes there's a misconception that it's just a series of procedures that we enact. And again, misconception. And we're going to uncover a little bit of that in just a minute here. So I pulled this definition from the Center on Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. If you're not familiar with MTSS or you want to dig further into MTSS, this is a great place to go. And this visual comes right from their website, including then this definition of multi-tiered systems of supports. And look at that. What is it? It's proactive and preventative. You remember that preventative word we talked about in the Science of Reading Defining Guide? What we're really trying to do is ensure that we get the right kind of instruction to students before there's dangers in their learning trajectory. Notice the orange here, it's a data-based decision-making related to program improvement. So it's not just about individual students, it's all about the program that we put around our students in order to help them achieve reading proficiency. It includes high quality instruction, intervention, social emotional learning, all of the things that wrap around and build out our educational program. And it's really a framework that's comprised of 4 essential components. And we're going to unpack these a little bit later, but there's screening, universal screening, progress monitoring, multi-leveled prevention system, and then database decision. And you heard that database decision again. You see that right in the center of their circle. So we're going to unpack these and we're going to see what kind of connections we have between MTSS and the science of reading. But before we do that, how do these 2 models fit together? So this is our MTSS process in which we're going to unpack. And the science of reading is really an evidence-based approach to reading instruction. And so it sits right inside that process. So we have done a lot of work, both here at Amplify with webinars, with Science of Reading, the podcast, to talk about elements of science of reading. What does that mean from our researchers, from implementation specialists? But what we want you to know is that that in and of itself won't get you the entire way. You need to have supports and systems all the way around to ensure that we're monitoring, we're watching students' progress, and then we're putting our resources in places that resources need to go to in terms of moving forward systems improvement. Okay, so now's the time that we're going to talk about a couple of science of reading frameworks. I'm looking at, looks like there's 236 people on this webinar. I'm pretty sure that the majority of the 236 have heard about these frameworks before, but bear with me because I think it's really important to understand how frameworks work and, you know, just sort of a baseline for where we're coming from with this. So as you know, when we talk about the science of reading here at Amplify, we're really referring to the simple view of reading. And what does the simple view of reading help us understand? It helps us understand that skilled reading is really a product of 2 things. Remember those misconceptions about it's just about phonics? Not at all. The 2 elements that are critical to skilled reading include language comprehension and word recognition. And even the authors of this framework pointed out in their original article that we know, right? Nobody says decoding equates to reading We understand that what's decoded or the words recognized on the page have to also be understood, or you can't get to skilled reading or skilled reading comprehension. And so it includes both language comprehension and it includes word recognition. You can't have just one or the other. The other framework we use is Scarborough's rope. And what Scarborough's rope does is help unpack language comprehension. You can see the simple view here, and word recognition. And in Scarborough's model, skilled reading really happens over here. After kids become really automatic in their word recognition, and they can put their cognitive energy in becoming more and more strategic. And so language comprehension involves knowledge and vocabulary, how sentences work, connections, creating a mental model. And for word recognition, we need to pay attention to sounds and the letters that represent those sounds and how those letters work in words. And so remember, we're not building decoders here. We're building automatic word recognizers. The idea that when you see a word in print, you actually can't unsee it and you recognize it right away. And so when we talk about the science of reading and what that looks like for instruction in the classroom, we want to make sure our instruction is including word recognition and language comprehension. And in the early grades, we're really working hard to develop automaticity such that when kids then get into more and more complex text, then they can use their energy for language comprehension. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's the basics. Claude Goldenberg reminds us, again, going back to dispelling that myth about the science of reading is just about word recognition or foundational skills. Dr. Goldenberg reminds us that literacy certainly requires more than the foundational skills, but if you don't have the foundations, you don't have much at all. And so we have to build that solid foundation, but we want to make sure that we pay attention to both. Okay, so that's our review of science of reading. For those of you that want to go back to earlier podcasts, if this is new to you, please do that. You can also in the show notes find information about digging into that a little bit more, or you can go to the Amplify website where we walk you through that in the resource section. Let's move into MTSS and think about this in terms of a systems approach. Why a systems approach? Well, I'm the daughter of an engineer, and so we often heard at the dinner table all about the systems that my dad was working towards. And so I think I informally got an engineering degree for sure. I informally got an engineering bent in terms of my approach to my work. But this idea of systems really resonates well with me in terms of how we're then building an educational system to support students in terms of developing proficiency. And so I did what everybody does, right? You grab a screenshot from Google about what the definition of system is. And I think it's worthwhile looking at both of these definitions because it will help us think then about MTSS, right? In the process of demystifying what it is. So first of all, a system is a set of things that work together. They're separate parts, separate things that happen, but they work together in an interconnected way. So think of the railroad system, right? Lots of pieces and parts to that puzzle, and they all have to work together in order to get somebody from one place to the other. The second definition here is it's a set of principles or procedures that you walk through to get something done, organized within a framework. And so they use the example here of the public school system. I won't say whether that's a good example or not a good example, but what I will tell you is that your principles and procedures to get the thing done in this framework needs to work together, and we need to make sure those mechanisms work together. Remember this working together piece, because as we talk about the elements of MTSS, we have to make sure they're in alignment or they're actually representing what we know about the best evidence of how students, in this instance, learn how to read. So I'm going to put that little image up in the corner just to remind us, right? So this is sort of the components and what needs to work together It needs to work together at every level of our educational system in order for it to get legs or be effective, in order for it to get the train from the station to the destination. And in this case, the destination is proficient reading. So if you think about at the district level, there has to be a system in place whereby you're working with the schools and the schools are working with the district and the classrooms are working together with the schools. So if each sort of like level of this system understands things a little bit differently or isn't in alignment, doesn't have the same common set of procedures, the system isn't going to work and it's going to be ineffective for those it's trying to reach, right? Which is the students in our classroom. So if you think about the system and you think about, we like to use the word alignment in education, think about alignment within this system. We want to make sure that things are very, very clear and that we're all working sort of with that same wheel of information. Before we sort of dive into those different elements, we want to make sure, and I'm going to go back one slide. You see those kids there on the bottom? We want to make sure that every level of the system is really focused on student outcomes, because that's the goal of this. It's not to just make better teachers. It's not just to have things moving smoothly throughout the school day or school year. It's really about focusing on student outcomes. Are we getting them to where we want them to go? And there's sort of two elements to focusing on student outcomes. First, there's proficiency. And we want to have at least 80% of our students that are not at risk. And we're going to talk about how we identify those students that are at risk. But that's a goal. Do we want more than 80? Sure. But if we could get 80% of our students in every single classroom, in every single school across the United States at levels of proficiency, that gives us a lot of room and energy to target those kids that are at risk and put our resources there. So proficiency is really important. The other thing that's really important is progress. So if you think about, let's say we have 80% of our students that are not at risk this year, are they still moving through the system in first grade and second grade and third grade? And are we able to keep 95% of those students not at risk or out of risk? And so those two factors are really important when you're looking at your data or you're thinking about your system or you're thinking about where you need to allocate resources. Are 80% of our students not at risk or out of risk? And do we keep at least 95% of those kids not at risk? And if we don't, what we need to do is then identify where it is. We need to look at the system and make changes or improvements. And so every level of that system, the district level, the school level, the classroom level, needs to be understanding both proficiency and progress. If that proficiency and progress isn't there, identify and understand that problem so we can plan for solutions, implement those solutions, and then monitor those solutions. I'm going to stop here for just a second. And not to plug the podcast, but I'm going to plug the podcast again here. So in the next episode of the podcast, Doug Reeves, I interviewed Doug Reeves, and I talked to him about implementation and what happens with implementation. And from his point of view, people stop too soon. So either they don't plan well, or they only implement a little tiny bit. And then they're like, well, this isn't working. We're going to jump ship and try something else. The goal here is really sort of that, making sure that we're planning and implementing in ways that we can monitor. And if things aren't happening the way we think they're supposed to be, we need to understand why. Is it because we didn't follow the plan? Did implementation not follow the plan? Is it because we actually need to think about a different solution? And so we're not going to solve it here, and I'm not going to help you understand all of that here, but know that what we want to do is make sure that we really understand that problem, plan adequately, implement, and then give that thing time to work and monitor as we're going through that implementation process. So key things here: proficiency, progress, plan and implement, and monitor. You know, you got to have all levels of your system working together in alignment. We talked about that. So we're going to unpack this a little bit, but we like to use this image or this graphic at Amplify to talk about that ecosystem. What do we mean by ecosystem? What we mean is you should have the tools, resources, and processes put in place in your schools and in your classrooms such that you have really strong core instruction that's actually working, that your differentiated instruction and practice, when you need to employ that, actually is an extension of and it supports that core instruction. When you need to have intervention outside of that core instructional block, that also is an extension of the core instruction designed to help students learn the thing that they didn't maybe learn in the core instruction. And you notice that we tie all of this together with a cycle of data. Now, that means that you need to have some sort of assessment to capture that data and understand that data. And if that data that you're capturing doesn't help you understand what to do next in core instruction or in differentiation or in intervention, you have a misalignment. So all of these things, your core instruction, your differentiation, your intervention, and then the assessment data that you're gathering need to all work together for the same goal of helping students learn to read. And what do we base all of this on? This is where the science of reading comes in, right? So all of these things should actually support students' development like we looked at in both Scarborough and the Simple View. Okay, key components of MTSS. Universal screening and progress monitoring. And we want to make sure that those tools are both valid and reliable. I'm not going to dig into what that means. You have an upcoming webinar that's going to cover a lot of this information about assessment, but why universal screening? What does that mean? What that means is, one, it's universal. That means we're administering the assessment to all of our students. And it's a screening measure. What's that mean? It means it's identifying risk. So think about in healthcare. So when I go to the doctor will put me through, or the nurse will put me through a series of screening measures. So I'll go in for my yearly check and I'll get my weight and I'll get my blood pressure. They take my pulse, they listen to my lungs, they take blood work. All of that is screening measures to identify things that are at risk. And so if they see some things in any of those screening measures, they may do further diagnosis or diagnostics to see if those risk indicators are actually tied to something else. Now, it could be that they're not, but it could be that they are. And so what we want to do is ensure that we're doing those screening all the way through students' early reading development, including beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year. And we're going to talk about how we use that data. Really important for universal screening. That helps you to allocate resources at the district level. It helps you at the school level, a principal, helps them know where are the places that we have a high population of students at risk that we need to infuse resources into. And that universal screener should also relate to progress monitoring. What's progress monitoring? Well, when you have students at risk, what you're going to do is you're going to intervene with them. You're going to give them some specialized instruction to meet their needs, and you're going to monitor how well they're responding to that intervention instruction. And so those progress monitoring cycles happen between your universal screening moments. And those progress monitoring moments are really important to track students' responsiveness. Problem solving. So what do we do when we see that we don't either have proficiency or progress? Well, this is where we're going to employ a problem solving process to identify the problem, try to analyze that problem. So the thing we don't want to do is jump from problem to solution before we sort of dig in and figure out, can we think about why this might be a problem? Are there things that we need to change? If in kindergarten, or let's use first grade as an example, in first grade, if I have a high percentage of my students that are at risk, maybe the first thing we want to look at is, what is our core instruction, right? Is there something wrong with the core instruction, either in kindergarten or early in first grade that we really need to analyze. So that process of analysis is really important. People either overanalyze or skip over analysis. So they either do it too much or forget about it. And so I think a good place to be is a happy medium. You want to analyze such that you can actually plan interventions and do something about it. So you want to take action as quickly as possible. But again, don't forget, you have to sort of dig in and see if you can build a hypothesis about why or what's going wrong. And then you want to plan interventions. And in the planning of these interventions, they need to be really clear. People need to understand what they're doing, when, and what they're watching for. And we need to also plan for how we're going to monitor, evaluate those plans. So sometimes it's through student outcome progress monitoring data, but sometimes it's also through implementation fidelity. So if I say, with this group of first grade students, I'm going to provide them intervention outside of core instruction 3 days a week for 30 minutes, the 3 days a week. Well, are we monitoring to make sure we're actually implementing that? Because 4 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now, if the students aren't making progress, is it because the intervention isn't working or the intervention was never given? We didn't essentially take the medicine. And so we want to make sure that we monitor that both in terms of fidelity and then for outcomes. Another key component is the tiered systems of supports. And we're going to come back to that, but that's that RTI model, right? Where every student gets core instruction, some students receive additional instruction. And there's some misconceptions with that model too that we'll come back to in a minute. And then the last of the key components is really a collaborative team-based approach. I think it's John Hattie's work that said one of the biggest impacts, the biggest effect size is collectively doing work together and collectively believing that we can actually get students to the outcomes that we want them to get to. And so that collective collaboration in a team-based approach is really, really important. It's not teachers working in isolation by themselves. It's not schools trying to do it on their own. Remember, it's the entire system working together to ensure students are making progress. So RTI, how does RTI fit into this multi-tiered systems of support? So RTI is really the tiered system. And again, we get this model from the healthcare industry. And the numbers aren't exactly perfect, right? But what we want to say is that we hope that 80% of our students are just fine making good progress in core instruction. And hope isn't exactly the best strategy. So if students aren't, 80% of your students are not out of risk categories, you need to look at what's happening in that core instructional time. The investment that you make in that block is so important because what we're trying to do is prevent further reading intervention or further reading difficulties. And so if your triangle is flipped upside down where you say, you know what, there's only maybe 5% of the students in our classrooms that can actually engage in core instruction, and that's all they need. You might have to look at your core instruction and do something differently. But the other thing I want you to remember about this triangle is that just because it says 80% here, we really should say 100% of our kids should be in core instruction. So you should never pull students out of reading instruction, the grade level reading instruction, to give them interventions. They should always, always have access to grade level instruction in both reading and math, actually, or all content areas. But for now, we're talking about reading. Core instruction is super important. When kids need intervention, you need to do that in addition to that core block. And so the only way kids are going to fill gaps or catch up to their peers is additional time in instruction. And that's okay. Some kids need additional time. We just make sure that we're really targeted about how that happens. And then there's some students that need really, really intensive intervention. And this may be a super specialized program that they need. But again, all in service of those grade level outcomes. You notice in this image, we put assessment all the way around this triangle, just as a reminder that what we need to do is make sure in a data-driven approach that we've encapsulated this whole thing with assessment data that actually helps us understand where kids are in the process. And the other thing I want you to remember here too is this is why we do universal screening, to see where kids are moving between these. Because if we have a kid at risk right now at the beginning of the year, we want to make sure that kid stays out of risk for the middle of the year and for the end of the year. And so that's where that universal screening will help. Speaking of universal screening, we're going to take just a minute to look at this kindergarten class. And actually, it's probably a grade level based on the numbers. But anyway, let's just pretend that this is a kindergarten grade level at a school. And you notice at the beginning of the year, we have kids in risk here. So red and yellow represents kids that are at risk. Green and blue are kids that are right now aren't at risk. And blue is, kids that are pretty secure in where they're at right now. So this is the beginning of the year. And again, then we're going to benchmark them at middle of the year, again, administering that universal screener to all students. And if you look at levels of red, levels of yellow, or levels at risk, notice what happened between beginning of the year to middle of the year. I'm going to pop this little triangle here on the bottom left-hand side so that you can actually compare this then to where you think we should be. And you'll notice, is the instruction here in kindergarten working? And given the fact that we're growing, we're shrinking our red, we're shrinking our yellow, that means we're shrinking the number of students at risk, and we're growing the number of students that are not at risk, looking at end of the year, shrinking those risk levels even more. This is a kindergarten classroom or kindergarten grade level that really is making it happen, right? Their core instruction is probably really, really strong. They're using science of reading models. They're monitoring those students, the students that are at risk. They're probably getting them intervention that those students need. Resources are allocated to those students within the system such that they can actually grow and improve. Now, this is actual data, so it can be done. It takes a focused effort, but with strong core instruction, appropriate interventions, and then just really a focus on student outcomes, this universal screening. Using universal screening, you can see that these kindergarten classrooms were very successful. So probably what's happening in this process as well is this data that's being uncovered is being used to answer a couple of questions. First of all, we've already talked about it. How effective is our core instruction? And that if you're having an intervention, you say, I'm having an intervention issue. We have so many kids that are needing intervention. The first place you should always look is your core instruction. And then we also use this data to figure out which students need additional instruction and in what areas. Let's think about how we could use these and answer these two questions at the different levels of the system. So at the district level, a district leader could aggregate this kindergarten information from all of the schools across the district and really look and see where is it that we have high risk levels across the district, and where do, as a district leader, I need to allocate additional resources to help move those kids or do something different. At the school level, a building principal can look at this data and answer the same question. What grade levels are my students at the highest risk, and how can I allocate resources? Whether that's intervention resources or is looking at core instructional resources. So the building administrator can use this data too, to allocate the resources to the highest priority needs. And a classroom teacher can look at this as well. How effective is my core instruction in my classroom? And what students need in instruction, and how can I allocate my precious instructional time or any support staff that I have supporting my classroom for which students in which areas. And you can't just stop this analysis or asking these two questions after the beginning of the year. You need to follow these students through this universal screening process so that you can think about resource allocation in the middle of the year. Maybe you have to reallocate resources because you see places like this that are declining and maybe other places that aren't. And then what about the end of the year? Well, you can use the end of the year information then to plan for the next year. So if we know this class of kindergarten kids is leaving and they look like they have low risk levels, when they come into first grade, we're not going to anticipate necessarily that they'll have high levels of at risk, where we can, before the start of the school year, maybe allocate resources differently, while always monitoring and watching and making adjustments as needed. I talked a little bit about that tier one or that core instruction. What are you delivering all students during that core instructional block? And there is some evidence that business as usual, going to a high quality curriculum can actually boost student achievement. So when you're thinking about what's happening in that core instructional block, that's where you can go back to the science of reading evidence and say, is my core program doing the thing that the science tells us we need to do? And if it's not, how can we make some changes? And we also know this goes back to the cost effectiveness, right? That if we actually invest in prevention, it's cheaper, both monetarily and on the impact of students later in their life. And so thinking about making that high quality, that core instructional block high quality, is really important. So I spent some time on the podcast talking with Dr. Brittney Bills, who she's truly an expert in MTSS. And I thought what I would do is just play you about 5 minutes of this podcast, because I think it's particularly important to talk about, she talks about all of the elements we've just talked about. And so I'm going to pop this on, and Victoria, I know you're still there. So if you can't hear it or something's wrong with the audio, please shout out.
You used the word MTSS, or the letters MTSS, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that, because I'm pretty sure that most of our listener base has heard MTSS before and may know something or a lot about MTSS. Can you just give us, like, what is it? What are the key elements? Just school us a little bit in MTSS.
Yeah, I'd love to. So MTSS is similar to response to intervention. It's multi-tiered system of supports, okay, is what it stands for. And it's similar to RTI, or response to intervention, in that it is a problem-solving model, right? Now, where it differs a little bit from response to intervention was, as evidenced by its name, right, response to intervention, was always more so of like an intervention focus, right? We use tools to identify students, and then we identify the interventions that they need in order to be successful. Within an MTSS framework, or an MTSS model, the thought is that universal tier is the first intervention for all students, right? And it presents the greatest opportunity for us to have an impact, because that's usually the time of the day where we spend the most instructional time, right? Where all of our students are with us together in one space. And if you have, good high quality instructional materials and knowledgeable teachers, like it just is the greatest opportunity to have the largest impact. And another kind of key component of that framework, and thinking about that universal tier within an MTSS model, the focus is really on prevention, right? So we want to prevent students from developing a reading difficulty, right? And so we are going to put into place all of the things that we need in order to prevent students from having that difficulty, that ongoing difficulty at third grade and beyond. And so one of the things I think about as I think about like the science of reading, right? Yeah. And how the science of reading really fits within an MTSS model, it's such a nice fit, right? Because we think about our universal tier, and we think about, using high quality instructional materials. And that's great. We want to do those things. But the reality of it is that all of our schools are different, right? In my district, I have 14 elementary schools, and they're all very different from one another. And so when we think about like our universal screening data and, all of those pieces, we really think about first, problem solving around our universal tier first, right? Based off of our data. So what does our data demonstrate our students need within that universal tier? And how can we apply evidence-based practices as they relate to the science of reading to beef up universal tier and opportunities for our students first there, right? And then it's a layering on of supports and problem solving at those other layers, the targeted and intensive tiers after that, right? But we really want to focus on that universal tier. Some other kind of key pieces of it is that universal screening. You know, it's really important that districts have evidence-based universal screening tools. I know not all districts use measures that are really sensitive to those critical early literacy pieces. And so it's really important for districts to evaluate their assessments. You know, a lot of researchers will recommend that you do an assessment audit and just see, you know, if you have assessments that are gathering all of the data that you need around the different aspects of literacy. That was a major missing piece for us that we put into place just a few years ago, and honestly, just this year for all of our students K-5. And then another big piece is really that fidelity of implementation. You know what I mean? We're implementing things as they were intended to be implemented, as they were designed. And before we make decisions about, you know, changing a program or changing our practices or changing our strategy, we want to make sure first that we implemented the way that we said we would, right? In the way that the programs were intended to be implemented. So, and then really the final piece, which also is very similar to a response intervention model, is that progress monitoring piece, that ongoing monitoring, right, of students. But I really like to think about it as we problem solve around every tier, right? Beginning with universal tier, we apply strategies, right? We monitor whether those strategies worked within that universal tier, and we continue to problem solve if things aren't working, right? And we move up as through that process, but we don't forget and we don't ignore universal tier and go straight to tier 2 and tier 3.
Thanks for hanging with me to listen to Dr. Bills, but a couple of things that I think are really, really important about what she said. You get the sense that MTSS isn't, oh, we're going to do it this year, and then next year we're going to do something else. MTSS is really an approach that you use every year over and over and over and over. So it's not a initiative that's going to last for 3 to 5 years. It's an initiative and a system that you need to put in place to really sustain then evidence-based practices over time, ensuring students are learning how to read. The other thing that I loved that she highlighted was she was pretty transparent about their need to get a universal screener in place, something that they didn't have before, that they weren't really assessing their students in ways that they could identify risk in grades K through 5. And so she recommended or talked about an assessment audit. And that is, and I'm going to actually go back in the deck here because I want to remind us that this, right? That audit, you may have to do an audit of your assessment practices. You may have to do an audit of your core instruction. Maybe you have different core instruction in every single classroom. Who knows? You may have to do an audit of the practices that are in the classroom. You may have to do an audit of your intervention supports, all in the service of making sure we're aligned to science of reading based practices. And so I just love that reminder by her that sometimes you have to look at what's happening right now before you can actually figure out what you need to do next. All right, let's get back up to that slide. If you want to listen to this and you didn't get a chance to listen to it, season 5, episode 5, it's a great 55 minutes long, but it's a great episode all about an implementation in a district and how Dr. Brittney Bills really led that implementation and the things that they're finding with that. So sort of to summarize what we were talking about here, MTSS is really, again, a framework. And remember, we're using student performance data. And so it's all built around the students and how they're performing proficiency and how they're progressing in their learning over time. And we're doing that so that we can, first off, allocate resources to improve learning for the greatest number of students. We don't want to be in that intervention cycle of having so many kids that need intervention and allocating resources. Not only is that expensive, but it doesn't feel good to kids. So if we know what works in terms of evidence-based practices, science of reading-based practices, implement those practices and monitor and see how well they're doing, because this is going to help particularly those kids that are most vulnerable. And it really helps us think about efficiencies. Again, going back to say, this isn't just about one classroom teacher implementing in her or his own classroom. It's really about systems working together. It's what happens at the district level, at the school level, to then support teachers to really then deliver the instruction they need to deliver and pay attention to those students that they need to support within the classroom. I know this was just a really high level overview. Before we move to the next webinars in this series, a few episodes that might be helpful in terms of thinking about elements of the system. In season 2, episode 1, we talked to Dr. LaTanya Goffney from Auditing, Texas, and she really talks about how when she went into that district, at large, very large district, when she went into it, how she really stopped the train on some of their literacy practices by focusing on the student data and putting that student data first. And so just really interesting process. She was very brave in terms of, like I said, stopping the train on some things that were happening there because she recognized that the students weren't achieving. In season 5, episode 3, Dr. Jan Hasbrook, she is also going to join us. You'll see that in an upcoming webinar, but she really talks about the right assessment and the right data. So do you need support thinking through what that should look like and how to use it? Hop on there because she is an expert in terms of putting that right assessment and using that data and how to help all students with it. And then again, Dr. Brittney Bills with season 5, episode 5. And I also give you a preview of what's coming up in the next drop of the podcast episode, which is with Doug Reeves in terms of implementation and systems. So upcoming webinars. Monday, October 3rd, that's only a week away, data-driven instruction. And you are going to be lucky to hear from Dr. Danielle D'Amico, who is an Amplify friend, as well as I think Dr. Nancy Nelson. And they will be talking about what this element of data-driven instruction means. We're going to have October 10th, something on Dyslexia Awareness Month, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be with Dr. Jan Hasbrook. And then the Science of Reading meets core instruction. So how to use then this MTSS process, the science of reading, to really look at what's happening in your core instruction or your tier 1 instruction and how then you bring the research to life. So if you haven't signed up for these, please sign up for these. They will be a deep dive into some of these key components of the science of reading and MTSS. I am going to look here, Victoria, I think at some of these questions. What does an audit of assessments look like? And an example, Amelia, that's a really great question. And if you go to this, I'm going to go back in the deck and put back up that website for MTSS. Michigan also has a great center. But if you go to the multi-center tiered systems of supports, I'm pretty sure they have an assessment sort of survey. But essentially what you're going to do is you're going to write down all the assessments you administer to the kids, what information you're getting from that assessment, how you use that assessment instructionally. And you may find that you're over assessing. Dr. Jan Hasbrook also talks about this in her podcast episode. Another question here, should the universal screener be aligned across the entire school? For example, our schools use MAP growth as a universal screener, but kindergarten teams don't implement. And I would say what you need to do, this is a great place. So as our kindergarten teams use Dibbles as their universal screener, Dibbles is a great universal screener. What you need to do, the best thing to do, is to go back and look at the information that you're getting from your NWA map. That growth and proficiency really can help you understand students, how they're growing in certain areas. But something like Ames Web or Dibbles will really get you those discrete measures on reading that you're going to be able to understand. Do the kids have these things over time? And so I would really encourage you to go and dig into that map a little bit, that map reporting data, and find out what it is they're reporting on. And does that actually give you the information that you need to target and track those students? And then the last one, let's see. So for those classrooms where prior core instruction was insufficient, what can teachers do to ensure grade level content is being covered and they're teaching the students who need to be taught prior grade level skills? This is a great question. It's complicated, right? But, and we know the data, especially our second graders who really never saw normal instruction, like in-person instruction. Here's where a universal screener is going to be super helpful to you, is to really understand what students you have at risk. And then you're going to think about those students just like you would second grade students, third grade students. You need to deliver them core instruction and then also additional time to catch up. So if you don't give them, if you have a whole class of third graders that need some additional support, but you don't give them third grade core instruction, they're going to fall further and further behind. So for a while, you're going to have to allocate extra instructional minutes, because that's what you have to do, right? If kids need to learn more stuff, you got to give them more time to learn it. And you're going to have to then deliver that instruction and deliver the instruction that they need to have to support them moving forward. Otherwise, we're going to have a generation of kids that are always just behind, grade over grade over grade over grade. I know it's not easy, but we really need to, when kids need to learn, we got to give them the time and the appropriate instruction to help them learn. Again, that's where your universal screeners and progress monitors will really help you. So, Victoria, is there anything that you want to say in closing?
No, I just think you are amazing, Susan, as always. I think this was such a great introduction to our webinar series. Thank you again for joining us, everyone. The chat was amazing, so interactive, and thank you all for your amazing questions. Please check back for more webinars. We are scheduling them through the remainder of the year. Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and have a great rest of your day. And you will be receiving a certificate of attendance and a link to the recording of the webinar. And Susan, if we can send the slide decks out after, that would be great.
Great.
All right. Thank you, everybody.